Good morning. Hi. Thank you. Hi, Pearl. Can't do it. Come in and have a seat. Good morning. This morning we are going to have a talk by the wonderful artist Rhee that's going to deal with materials. I just want to go through quickly what we have coming up again. In 2 weeks we have a curator, Fionn Mead. And then that'll be week 6, and then week 7 is an extra week with a couple of writers, Michael Mead and Anka Krostofovich. And then week 8 is Molly Zuckerman Hartung, who's a painter, another material artist. And then we're hoping for a group of seniors to be giving very brief presentations in week 10, and we're hoping to have participation from various programs, and that's being coordinated. So if you're graduating and working on a long project and you'd like to have a moment of presenting work publicly, speak to your faculty and also try to show up as audience, even if you're not. That would be a great event and opportunity. So just to remind you that at the end of the talk, it's about an hour, there will be some time for Q&A. Please don't choose that as the moment to pack up and leave. It's very disruptive, and it's also sort of counters one of the reasons we do things live, which is to have that back and forth conversation. So I do think, do we have microphones for questions? We do. Otherwise, Rob, if you would repeat the question for the recording. We have Cecilia Jeffrey, who is a student in multiple dimensions, who will be giving us the introduction for Rob.
Hi, I'm really excited to be introducing Rhee today. He is a visual artist and writer whose body of work compels viewers to question how our bodies might sometimes work against us. Much of his sculptural work raises the question of boundaries, barriers, and cages. Do they impede growth or inspire adaptation? Rhee has sent a series of welded metal forecasts to gourd farmers who planted the seeds within the warped forms. The gourds would grow no matter what was in the way, and they relentlessly ballooned outwards and subsumed the metal. From Rhee's work, one could gather that identity is a chance encounter between softness and force. His use of the ready-made includes natural and manufactured objects: eggs, pine cones, and hair curlers. He uses items around him to create meaning, and his art is a constant exploration of things that go together and things that don't. Please welcome Rhee.
Hi. Hi. All right. Robert Rhee was born on a Friday. His parents are both Korean immigrants whose American names start with S. He has an older brother and a half-sister who was first introduced to him as his piano teacher. His father's mother lived on Roosevelt Island for 9 years and had a Casio keyboard with preset songs, of which his favorite was Ave Maria. She was not a Catholic. Robert was a born-again Christian from when he was 12 until he was 16. During that period, he believed that his best friend, S. Rabinowitz, would go to hell for not accepting Jesus into his soul, and, with a group of church friends, once gouged his palm with a nail. His mother owns a jewelry store and has perfect teeth. She slipped and fell on icy stairs 2 weeks before he was born. Robert Rhee grew up in a house with 16 doors. His mother's mother is less than 5 feet tall and picks fern bracken in the park, which she knows is against the law. Before his mother's father died, he owned a jewelry store in Manhattan, and before that, he was the Korean ambassador to certain French-speaking parts of northern Africa. He was an extremely picky eater. Robert's father will eat anything. Sometimes Robert refuses to eat with his father, Sammy, especially when Sammy puts donuts in soup or mixes Korean food with American food in a way Robert finds inappropriate. Sammy has been, among other things, a real estate agent, a golf teacher, an actor, a banker, a millionaire import-export tycoon, a member of the Korean CIA, and most recently, a mental health aide at the Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens. Kim Jong-il. My father looks more like Kim Il-sung than Kim Jong-il, even though he played Kim Jong-il twice on Late Night with Conan O'Brien and once for a Geico commercial that never aired. His version of the impish North Korean dictator held supremacy in the early summer months of 2005, before interest in Kim Jong-il and consequently my father, whose fluency portraying a deranged communist villain prince lacked other outlets, were replaced by Hurricane Katrina and the increasing instability in Iraq. My father's father, Rhee Soo-hwan, was born in 1920 in the town of Sapyo on the east coast of what is now North Korea. He belonged to the traditional ruling class of landed aristocrats known as Yangban, who controlled Korea during the 600-year reign of the Chosun dynasty, which ended with the Japanese occupation from 1910 to 1945. Throughout this period, most Yangban collaborated with the unpopular and often ruthless Japanese colonial government as a means of protecting their land and privileges. The occupation was good to my grandfather. When he turned 30 years old, he controlled every property he could walk to in every direction. On the day my father was born, my grandfather took him to the highest point of their 99-room palace and marked out his place in the world. Holding a small, slippery arm in his fingers, he signed the earth from sky to sky. He wrote, "You are my first son." He marked 2 points in time and drew a line. "I am the second son of Rhee," he said, the 8th-generation grandson of Grand Prince Imyong, the 4th brother of Sejong the Great of Chosun, who gave us the alphabet in which everything is written. This land, these people, these 2 hands belong to you. By the time my father could tell this story, the Korean War had come and gone. My grandfather, having lost his titles and deeds to communist reforms in the North, had moved the family south and started a lucrative business salvaging metal from the eclectic military carnage that had been building up in the waters surrounding Korea. 5 years later, he lost everything to a scam involving an actual gold mine, which, instead of producing the promised wealth of sand gold, like regular gold, only more valuable, returned the more probable combination of lawsuits, debt collectors, and body pains. In the years that followed, the family with 6 children moved from an honest mansion on the water to a trailer attached to a church. Everyone old enough to complain went to work, and my grandfather started some more failed businesses, including a rabbit factory, a homeopathic pharmacy, and a line of traditional ginger teas. 20 years later, dying of lung cancer in an American hospital at the age of 52, my grandfather cried bitterly and demanded new doctors, new hospitals, experimental procedures. He marked 2 points in time and drew a line on an axis now bisected, collapsed, and forgotten. "Bury me in Sapyo," he warned, "or the chain will be broken." A 600-year-old chain feels less like jewelry than a yoke. They laughed, but he was focused, suddenly more hurried than afraid. "Promise me," he begged my father, his first son. "Promise me you will become the president of a unified Korea." When my father played Kim Jong-il on TV, he was 62 years old and on his way to becoming a successful character actor, and not a mailman, a missionary, a real estate agent, or a CEO. He had been speaking about all these possibilities with equal weight up until that point. but afterwards just waited for phone calls and cheered on North Korea's bizarre forays into nuclear brinksmanship. He landed one more role as a North Korean refugee on Tough Crowd with Colin Quinn, where he essayed comedian Bruce Bruce with a parade of axe kicks and was thereafter considered unpredictable. That summer, my father left for Korea to get his teeth fixed or star in a historical melodrama. While there, he either looked up old classmates or, at the public baths, befriended a group of old men who had also lost their jobs and spent their days pretending to be at work, taking long baths, sleeping on their stomachs, and reading each other's fortunes for lunch money. He spent a year deciphering their routine or participating in it. For a man who had once been, among other things, a member of the Korean CIA, a millionaire import-export tycoon in upstate New York, my father, then a 62-year-old out-of-work actor, felt as if he had barely narrowed down the field of life's possibilities. In 20 years at most, he would be gone. His name would join the list of Chosun princes that never became king. At some point in my life, having failed in Los Angeles, I called him in Korea and said I was moving back to New York. In 2 weeks, he returned home and found a 4-bedroom apartment on Roosevelt Island and 2 female boarders to subsidize the costs. I want to say I chose this over other, much worse possible living situations, though really at the time, I enjoyed the days I spent with my father much more than the nights I spent with my friends. My father and I were more or less in the same predicament, except I was young and he was overqualified. Somehow it felt good to know I had someone beat, even if that someone was half my biological self. When he was teaching golf, my father's advice was universal. Keep your head down, feet on the ground, and swing slowly. Play your own game. Envision your shot. Tuck in your shirt so you can feel it stretch on your backswing. He told his students he was a Zen master, which meant his memory was completely impersonal. I told him what Rauschenberg said about his studio practice. Quote, I pretend there's this guy Rauschenberg, and he's a painter, and I try to do things to help him out. And he agreed Rauschenberg was probably a Zen master too. Sometimes you end up becoming your own unknown. You look out from your life at 63 or 24 and see the paths of your becoming branching out in all directions, pointy, spectacular, and urchin-like. On one of these paths is a person just like you, wearing an olive polyester jumpsuit and a fool's haircut that lasts months. On another, there's a stranger doing the exact same thing. On yet another, there's the actual you giving a speech to 70 million non-latitudinal Koreans from the top of your first house in Sapyo. So you take the closest step forward, hoping you're moving towards yourself. So I've been asked to talk today about material and the role material plays in my work. I want to start by looking at the way comedians use the word material because I think it clarifies some things for me. Firstly, comedians, stand-up comics, when they talk about material, it's almost always possessive. It's their material, and it's almost always described in terms of time. So a comedian has 5 minutes, half an hour, but this time has physical properties. It can be tight or loose or solid. It can be a chunk, a bit, a set. And that really resonates with me because a lot of my work sits much more comfortably in time than it does in space. And I think that's worth saying just at the outset. Something else that I like about the way comedians talk about material, or even just the way, even what audiences hear when a comedian says the term material, is the understanding or the expectation that the material is an extension of the comedian. It's understood that a comic's materials are part of them, and that the material and the person delivering it are coextensive, they're reflexive. And if I were to paraphrase this process, you have a comic who encounters material in their daily life, they recognize it as material, and they mold it into a joke or some kind of joke structure. And then they deliver that joke starts to have a life, and then the comic becomes recognized for that joke, even for the material that they've created. So you have this kind of spiraling process where the comic shapes their material, the material shapes the comic, and so on and so on and so on. And my process is pretty similar. I think the kind of material I'm talking about and the kind of material I like to work with doesn't necessarily pre-exist in the world as material in the same way, let's say, wood or metal or clay do. And it becomes material through this act of self-identification. I think this is pretty similar to the way life becomes narrative in the biographic form, in that the materiality of the subject who becomes the object really becomes evident retrospectively. So I think there's a really interesting related conversation in biography about whether or not you can even write a biography until someone dies. The image on the screen is a sculpture from a body of work called Occupations of Uninhabited Space, which is an ongoing project that I started in 2012. Here, the material that I'm thinking about is not really the steel form or forecast, as I call it, and it's not even the individual gourd. But when I'm talking about material, I'm talking about the gourd's growth or the gourd's type. So in this case, we're looking at a bushel gourd. But what I'm interested in is whatever the force or the program inside the gourd that's expressing itself outward upon the skin. And that's really what I'm trying to work with. And I think the fact that I can't look at it directly or touch it directly or move it directly is what I'm interested in. It's part of the charm and the power of the material. So I started working with gourds 10 years ago, and I like gourds for a couple reasons. The first is that they're globally indigenous. I happened to be showing my work in a couple different countries at the time, and I thought it was really funny that wherever I showed gourds, people associated them with their own kind of naive craft folk culture. And so the gourds had this funny quality of being both authentic but also extremely generic. And I think it's because of their time scale. They've been around for 10,000 years. They're one of the first plants ever domesticated by humans. So they really do kind of play both roles. The other thing that I found interesting was that the gourds we have today are types that we've inherited from our ancestors. They're products of selective breeding, so that any individual gourd is both itself and an instance of its type. And these types are organized into characteristic shapes or technologies that are equally ancient. So this is a bottle gourd. There are dipper gourds, cannonball gourds, penis sheath gourds. The list is very evocative and goes on and on. So to get to the inherited type, which is my material, I can't just work on the gourd. It's in some ways not the site of the encounter. I have to either work with the gourd or at least get the gourd to work upon itself. So this is what the steel forecasts do. The gourd grows into them and through them. And in this process, the gourd is cleaved from the type. And in a way, the gourd gets released back to a kind of formlessness. For me, I think this material interaction, it happens in parallel both in the sculptures but also in my body. Because my body is really another site where these types are held. So when I'm in the metal shop and I'm twisting or welding a steel forecast in preparation for them to be placed in the field, the gourds that they're made for are still seeds. They don't exist yet. Or maybe that's going too far. They're just seeds. And yet, when I'm making the forecast, it's really the closest I ever get to the material. and I get close to them by imagining their growth, by visualizing their movement. And it's kind of like scrubbing back and forth in a timeline, where the timeline is the gourd's lifespan. And that's the material interaction that leads to these sculptures. I think that's the way in which I see them as directly biographic. And if you think about biography in terms of the etymology, you have bios, graphy, life in line or life writing. So these are quite similar in that they're a line forming of a life. So I want to show you three interconnected bodies of work where language plays a large role. This is a piece from my No End in Sight series, which are about 100 or so palm-sized sculptures that I completed in between 2006 and 2008. This piece is called Six Etudes for Four Hands from 2006, and it consists of 6 small sculptures, 6 videos, and then 6 props or kind of artifacts that come out of the making of the videos. Lastly, there's an edition book of short aphoristic writings, also called No End in Sight, or NEIS. So I worked simultaneously on these 3 bodies of work from 2005 to 2008 in the years between undergraduate and graduate school. And I think it's important to say that the works came directly out of the conditions of my life, which are my studio was small and domestic. It was in my apartment. I didn't have a lot of time, I didn't have a lot of money, and I didn't have a lot of tools. And in this case, I found those not as problems to be solved, but really as foundational parameters for the work. So of the 3 bodies of work, No End in Sight came first. When I was working on it, the works were almost all completed using found objects. In general, they were all palm-sized, and in general, they were all completed in one sitting. And then outside of these kind of parameters, these acknowledged parameters, I also had ways of working that just came naturally for me, which was I didn't go in with a script or a plan or even an idea. I just went in with a set of materials. And this is for the individual works and for the body of work as a whole. All the organizational parameters or characteristics that I've described, they came through the making. So I think another way of saying this is that one of the major aesthetic activities that I did in this body of work was I would make things so that I could categorize them. Then I could look at the categories and try to expand them through my making, and on and on and on. So a funny thing started happening with these works when I was making them and showing them. People really wanted, okay, so this is a piece from the No End in Sight series. People really wanted me to have an explanation, to be able to speak for the work, like a narrative or a backstory or a concept. They wanted to know what the work was about, which I felt was pretty ridiculous considering what it was and how it was presented. I also found it confusing because people expected me to have this thing that I never had and never realized I needed. And I thought that describing these works in terms of narratives or concepts or ideas, it wouldn't just be disingenuous, it would just actually be impossible for me. And it's not that these works exist outside of language, it's just that the language in which they're written is a material language. So if it were translated, this work would just be foam, paint, wood, sticker. Not particularly convincing. So at the time, I felt I needed to deal with this disconnect. So I started making these videos that invented stories for how the works were made. I set aside a few sculptures from my No End in Sight series that I would recreate or reenact in order to have the narratives of inspiration or answers people so consistently wanted. The videos I made were called 6 Etudes for 4 Hands, and in them, the backstories were all invented or at least mythologized. And they definitely came into being way after the sculptures themselves had been made. I actually found that in doing this, in decoupling the inspiration from the representation of inspiration, was actually really fun and actually inspiring in and of itself. So now I'd like to play you 2 videos from the series. The first is called Sumatra, and the second is called Devil's Dog. They're about 3 minutes apiece.
Robert, I throw away anchors. Okay? This one. Such. Or I just sit there. It's like, huh?
Just leave it alone. I still did them contracting.
Sumatra.
Thanks. So you've seen a couple of those No End in Sight pieces, the small sculptures. That was a clip, one of the videos from 6 Etudes for Four Hands. I'd like to take this moment now to read a few short excerpts from No End in Sight, the No End in Sight book, which alongside the small sculptures and the videos that I just played is part of the body of 3 works that I was building simultaneously. So I'm just going to let the video play in the background without sound as an accompaniment as I read these short excerpts. Heart scarab text. Heart of my mother, heart of my mother, heart of my actual being. Do not rise up against me as a witness. Do not contend with me in the court of judgment. Do not devise lies against me in front of the God, for the day of your reckoning is at hand. I and I. I connect the what to what. I connect mine to yours and we connect, or do they connect and we watch, interacting, stewarding? I record when for when, and if I don't, someone else will. And if that happens, I disappear, or they appear before me eventually. Survivorman. Previously airing on the Science Channel in the United States and the Outdoor Life Network in Canada, the short-lived TV show Survivorman revolved around the re-abandoning of survival expert Les Stroud without food, shelter, water, or a camera crew in extreme ecosystems all across the globe. In addition to overcoming impossible obstacles, he also had to film himself throughout, securing the survival of his footage as well as his life. Sometimes half the show would be spent on him looking for food, filming himself looking for food, talking about how his hunger was affecting him, chasing after an animal and setting untouched traps, then eating a handful of grass and moving on. After its first season, the show was canceled and replaced by another globe-trotting survival show called Man vs. Wild, now in its second season, which ditched the self-filming aspect and replaced the paunchy, balding survival expert with a young, fit Brit. Among other things, the show belongs to the history of the diary of Anne Frank. The Survivorman survives by documenting his survival. Recording makes surviving tangible. It makes the future, your audience, your story, physical. It tethers you to something else, a companion, a platform, something to save. A life recorded continues to end, breaking up the silence. Any excuse to speak, make language for something is a blessing. How often people die from a prolonged swallowing of the word help. Survival for most of us might not be an instinct, maybe just a promise. It's very rarely something you choose directly, more a rhythm that includes you. If people understood now what Otto Frank knew 60 years ago, every survival kit would include a camera, a camcorder, or at least some paper and a good pen. In addition to Band-Aids, flares, radio transmitters, etc. for the stranded, why not also provide for the survivors among them? Something to take home and bury, or speak through, or refresh obsessively like news. It would only be for those who knew they had been alone, actually alone in the world. An introduction. This is me. This is what happened. This is how it looked. This is what I did. All of this is me. This is me coming back. Behind the bookshelf. Begun on June 12, 1942, and unfinished on August 4, 1944, The Diary of Anne Frank was my first experience with writing in real time. The quarrels, the jokes, the news on the radio, the love story, the ending, everything happens the day before. The diary itself, I found in returning to it, is not the private document of a young girl deceased, but something technically more complex. Anne began the first version of her diary 3 weeks before her family went into hiding. She continued writing her private thoughts and feelings in it for almost 2 years. More interesting and largely unknown is the second version, Anne's revisions for publication. After hearing a radio broadcast from London on March 28, 1944, declaring the foundation of a Dutch Institute for Personal Documents of Life during the war, Anne set to work editing, revising, and at times adding to previous diary entries, with the understanding that they might one day be made public. She completed the edits on loose sheets of colored paper while continuing her diary, working at a feverish pace. Anne's second version is better written and more mature than the first, in addition to being more meaningful. It is Anne's multiplicity of voices that makes her diary extraordinary. Not its purity, but its completeness. Its pioneering use of documentary effects. If you're interested in seeing this process firsthand, I suggest The Diary of Anne Frank, the Revised Critical Edition, which juxtaposes Anne's original journal entries, her revised manuscript, and the diary as edited by her father and published by Doubleday in 1952. Otherwise, just pick up any paperback edition. From cover to cover, the space between your hands becomes hours, inches, pounds, an embodiment, an ordinary person. Hold the whole thing. It is real. Watch it happen to someone else. So I want to show you one more video. This is the last video from 6 Etudes for 4 Hands that I'm going to show. It's also 3 minutes, and it's called Devil's Dog. Thanks. So the last thing I want to say about these three works that I made simultaneously, the small objects, the videos, and this book, is that the three all revolve around thoughts I was having about artifacts and their relationship to artworks. Particularly the fact that artifacts are more explicitly anchored in the flow of time. And the artifact as a kind of model recurs in my work, and I think it has to do with a focus on certain kinds of activities as opposed to certain kinds of outcomes. An interest in artifacts also led to an interest in documentary modes, such as diaries, filmic recordings, forms of testimony, and the way that these documentary modes not only capture experience, but format it. Also how the mundane is dealt with as a set of experiences. So the last body of work I'm going to discuss is called History of Equivalentistics, which is ongoing and involves my interventions into pre-existing rituals or reenactments. I started this work in 2003 when I was in Korea, and I did it over the course of a summer. So the two paired images on the left were taken at a designated photographic overlook, which gave a picturesque view of Mount Daemosan in Seoul. The two paired pictures on the right were taken at a changing of the guard ceremony in front of Changdeokgung Palace, also in Seoul. So the way I went about making this piece was I went to these two locations every day for about 3 months, and I would just ask random people to take my photograph. And I always wore the same thing and always stood in the same position or sat in the same position and held my posture in the same way. I would go and collect photographs during the day, and then at night I would print them out and look in my set for equivalences to photos that matched. With the idea being that I would keep going on in this process until I found an equivalence for each set. So for the images on the left, it took 631 attempts, and the images on the right, it took 327. So before going deeper into the particular work itself, I want to talk about choice and chance. I hope it's evident by now that I work with a variety of chance-based processes and even chance-based materials. I personally gravitate to circumstances where it's quite explicit that I'm not making all the decisions. And I think that's because I don't believe the art should come out of a conscious deliberative process at every step of the way. So for example, in Occupations of Uninhabited Space, the gourd growing project, the sculptures came out of an intuitive process, which by its very nature doesn't have lots of explicit moments of conscious deliberation, but comes out of a direct and complex relationship or engagement with the material. And then there's the whole category of events that we could call happenstance or coincidence or good luck or bad luck, which go into all works, but that I'm particularly interested in. So the No End in Sight sculptures and writings that I just read, they used coincidence very explicitly as a primary compositional technique. So in this piece, No End in Sight, in this piece, History of Equivalentistics, the whole structure is built around a proposed or potential coincidence. Like I had this idea that if you had hundreds and hundreds of photographers and you had them take the same generic photo, eventually you would get two that were the same. So for me, this is a very complex piece, and I don't want to give the impression that I was making it like with a single question in mind. In fact, there were lots of questions having to do with authenticity, ethnicity, reenactment, history, And in some ways, this was as much a spiritual inquiry as it was an intellectual one. So I just want to say that at the outset. In general, though, I was kind of dogged by this question of value. So if you had a set of 100 photographs, what criteria could you use to say that one was better or more valuable than any of the others? You know, what criteria could you use? What criteria would even be appropriate? And then what exactly would the different criteria illuminate? So the answer that I came up with, and which I explored in this piece, was coincidence. So uniqueness via sameness. I thought if you had a set of 100 photographs and there were two that were equivalent, they had a quality that was special. Something that, by virtue of being the least unique, somehow became the most unique. And I really liked this because it was on a precipice. It was on this like precipice of meaning, where it wasn't quite aesthetic and it wasn't quite scientific. It was just awkward, just like rough phenomena. I think another funny thing about this work is it's ongoing, mainly because the criteria of equivalence is so open-ended, and it's so dependent on so many things, like the amount of time I have, the amount of resources, my standard of measurement. So in this way, this piece could go on indefinitely. I was measuring the equivalence of these photos in a rough way, which got them to a rough visual equivalence. But of course, I could continue this project just by sharpening my standard of measurement. And then that act of sharpening could go on indefinitely and penetrate deeper and deeper into the photograph. So in a way, the two sets of photos are really paused as opposed to complete. So I have one more reading, and then I'd like to open it up to questions. I have this particular mug that was given to me by my aunt. Apparently the colors and patterns in the mug arrived from a process of firing and refiring, which in the case of this mug took place 84 times. Clearly excessive. I find this fascinating because it seems unlikely that one could have a clear sense of what has gotten better or worse for the vast majority of firings, save for the last couple or the very first. How important is it for the artist to be able to say that after firing number 84, the mug was unequivocally better than it was at any point before or after the preceding attempts? Actually, I think it's neither particularly important nor preferable, since as an artist one works by creating and responding to trends, and not by analyzing computations or exact values. This is important because in the process of doing something over and over, and in this case 84 times, one can gain a sense of ownership over tendencies which come from the materials and the processes themselves. What a potter who fires a mug 84 times is looking for, I believe, and what I've been looking for in my No End in Sight series, are encounters with certain qualities: size, color, texture, shape, place, that over time enable a personal sense of fluency in a language native to the materials. It's like speaking versus dreaming in a foreign language. One is about skill, and the other is about intuition. The artist's voice presents itself in connections drawn angularly across time. Chance brings everything together, colliding everything into everything. The role of identity is to map out these collisions, pull them into figuration, and when necessary, to create narratives or distances that push all that is hurtling towards each other apart. What does an egg have to do with a pine cone? What is the distance between a rock and a foam rubber orange? What does it mean that a thin plastic straw might fit exactly into the hole of a hair curler? These unreasonable collisions draw a pattern. I think of a bull charging at a red cape. It does not matter that bulls are colorblind, because the people in the audience above are sensitive to color and its associations. The juggernaut rushes forward with destructive force. The bull and the cape are in one arena. The audience and the cape's color are above it. The bullfighter's operations below create a narrative above that dramatizes an impossible collision between the bull's mind and their own, and draws people's attention away from all the bulls not encircled, charging powerfully with no particular point. The fog of meaningless collisions drumming the walls of the arena are somewhat silenced, somewhat embodied, somewhat honored by the image of a single engagement in which one force relentlessly attempts to make contact with another. A final point I want to make is that there is a very important dynamic involved here between the rationality of perceiving patterns and the irrationality of choosing when and why a pattern must begin or end. I think sometimes we attach ourselves so fully to completion as a goal that we fail to consider lack of completion as a tool or a method. Part of my process in No End in Sight was taking objects that were very clearly complete and proceeding as if they were not. Much more of my work went into removing completion rather than reinstating it, because once a material had truly been reopened, had truly reemerged into the field of relentless collision, the process of completion was often instantaneous. What does the number 84 mark? 84 marks the introduction of both completion and lack of completion. 84 is the length of chaos, the dimension of meaning. Thanks. So I don't know how the Q&A works, but how does it work?
Usually if you give people a moment,
Okay.
shy at first, and then they start to come up. There is a microphone that we can pass around, and if they refuse it, which sometimes then if you would sort of repeat the question, because it's not always clear.
Hi, thanks so very much. So you talked about a relationship between these works and language, and you're not necessarily incorporating words or language explicitly, per se, in a lot of the work that's there. I'm also very interested in language, but in the specific materiality of words themselves. And so I'm just curious about, with these images and their relationships to language, there's this place where meaning's just not there, you know, or where meaning, not necessarily in your work, I'm saying that you put language or words or images out there, and it appears to me that meaning comes from somewhere else. I'm just curious where you feel meaning is derived from, or where it's located.
These are going to be deep questions today, huh? It's kind of lame for me to wait on the first question, but it's a big one. So maybe I will come back to it. Yeah, because I think once I get going, I'll be able to tackle it.
I don't think that my question's any easier. And I'm really sorry, but I'm just gonna put this out there. In my class, we've been talking a lot about like how after you create art, it dies, right?
Yeah.
And you talked about how like there's like a debate on whether biography should be written after death, but you also talk about how your art has no narrative. So like what is your take on like art is dead? Like basically is my question.
So the way I'm interpreting this question is like, when you say art, I'm hearing the art object. And is that?
Yes.
Okay, so like the art object as an artifact, so that in some ways, in the same way, like you see a spoon in a museum, what you're seeing is a representation of an activity, which is in itself kind of absurd, because the spoon, its meaning comes between your hand and your mouth. Well, I think I guess one thing I'll say is I like these questions because a lot of the really important things in my work, I have multiple answers for, partly because they're questions that I can't answer. So like, the extent to which art is real, is embodied, is experienced in objects as opposed to in the experience of making or in the experience of even destroying or sharing. I don't think there's a single or even hierarchical site of art. And I think you can see this in a variety of ways, like the Six Etudes videos where I'm kind of parodying the making process, the inspiration process of art. There's also a lot of truth there. A lot of times when I'm making in the studio, I wish I could just have someone be there with me watching it, because in some ways the studio is where I think some of the most fun happens, the most exciting stuff. And so, like the readings about recording and diaries and documentary modes, I was literally trying to, I had this thing in my mind called the witness suit, where it'd be like this thing that I would embody so that people could have my experience and not have it like through my art. It could just be like downloaded directly into their consciousness. But I think more and more I realized, oh, this is not a problem. The intermediary of language, the intermediary of language is not a problem. The intermediary of my body in the world is not a problem. It's a foundational concept. It's what makes things exciting. So like, it would perhaps be a more efficient world if I could just mind beam me into you, and you could mind but in some ways, all of the richness that we consider to be art, or the things that make life meaningful, I think come from these, the way we handle these intermediaries. Okay. And I think that relates Two birds.
Thank you for that response. It was just excellent answer to both
Oh,
those
thanks.
questions. I am curious, you have such a wide range of materials and you were really good at focusing on your materials. Do you have any idea where to next? What you feel like you're kind of going towards in your trajectory as a material artist?
In some ways, my best answer, you just saw it. It's like retrospective. So like I have materials I'm working with right now. I'm using this material alginate, which is like a dental casting material. And it's used to make, it's a dental mold making material. It's like that pink kind of stuff. So it's really interesting because it's used to make impressions, but if you use it as a casting material, as it dries, it deforms and distorts and shrinks quite a bit. So I've been really interested in that it's something that can take an impression and then as it dries, it starts to shape itself, and it starts to lose information or corrupt information, and it's necessarily a process I can't control. So I do. One thing that has recurred to me a lot is this idea that relationship is a fundamental characteristic of form. So I try not to think about things like atomically. I like relationships, and my relationship with the alginate is rich. And so that's what steers me, is whether or not we're both growing.
It might have been brought up in your introduction, but I'm interested in more information about what was it that really started you on the path to making, or what made you have to make something, that object, that first thing?
I'm trying to answer this question and not embarrass myself. Probably the first, art making was always a form of communication, of connection, of reverence. So the first artworks I made were for people. And they weren't even artworks as such. They were objects or experiences that I wanted to share with a single person. And I came to art very accidentally. I started as a writer, or I thought I was going to be a lawyer, a successful lawyer who wrote on the side, and then had this seamless literary career after I gained all this cultural capital as a lawyer, and then I had to I took this sculpture. Oh no, I had to get a work study job. And the two jobs that I wanted, one was to drive the Zamboni in the ice skating rink, which I didn't get, and the other was to work in the wood shop. And so I worked in the wood shop, and I made this bookshelf for someone, and the sculpture teacher saw it and said, "Oh, if you like making things, come make things with us." And I took a sculpture class, and then I was just kind of there a lot. And then Jessica Stockholder, who was running the sculpture program, was like, "You're here all the time. Come. On Wednesdays, we have these critiques. Just come to one of these critiques." So, I was a suburban kid from Long Island, and it was Wednesday night critiques. I didn't know anything, and you would go to a room, and there would be a flame, or dust, and then a pile, and then something, and there would be arguments over what it was, what the boundaries were, what the stakes were, and I was so electrified. And so I was in some ways, I just wanted to keep being a part of that. Maybe that's as much about being an artist and a teacher as it is about being an artist. But that's my favorite part of art, this belief that what we do matters. And then the sharing of that belief in discourse. Yeah, sorry.
Being that what I assume your work is, I would say avant-garde modern art. I don't want to label you or anything.
I like it.
And trying to phrase this rather as the most respectful as possible. I don't understand your work, and I'm not going to try to, but how do you deal with people who have these material resistances rather to what you do, or what rather your colleagues do?
Yeah. Well, one thing I've been thinking a lot about, well, first I want to acknowledge that comment and say that I think it's an honest and a true thing. That at first, when I used to hear questions like this, I thought of them as attacks, but the more I realized it was like somebody reaching out and saying like, bring me in. Where's the entrance? So one thing I think a lot about, and I've been thinking a lot about recently, is I took this class on Buddhist autobiography when I was in grad school. And before we even started the class, the teacher said, like, just as a disclaimer, the texts that we're going to read are religious texts. We're going to read them in a way that has no relationship to belief. So already we're doing a bastardized thing. Secondly, the way we're reading them as texts, where I'm giving this to you and you're reading it, is not only different from the original context, it attacks the original context. Because the way these texts were originally experienced was in a relationship. You would have a tutor, and you would start out with the tutor, and they would tell you little stories from the text. And eventually, through that storytelling, you would get some sense of the whole text. After some point, after you'd heard some stories, you could ask questions about those stories. And there was this questioning and hearing. Then you were allowed to hear the whole story end to end, in its entirety. Then you were allowed to hear that whole story and write down things that stood out to you. Then, after all of that, you got the text, right? Our culture is the opposite of that. Like, even this context, it's like the text, right? In some ways, there's so much prerequisite that comes in with experiencing a text, being given a text. I think that's a big issue. One way that I've tried to deal with that in this talk is this notion of repetition. So maybe via a process of repetition, something comes to stands out for you. But that's the only answer I have, is that that certain formats require things that are not explicitly asked. Thank you. Yeah.
I kind of had two questions. I'm curious about 84, if you could expand on that. And then I don't know if this is probably too deep. But your readings with, was it Anne?
And Frank.
Frank. If you could maybe touch on some of the personal connections that you had, maybe that sparked like this, like, how do I a connection to that in a way that I was drawn into the story of their life and kind of reflecting in your own, if there was any kind of aha moments or like, it's strange that this is a different time, but we are still connected through experience because it's a very experience. What you've said about her writing is that there's a lot of refinement, and I find that fascinating, and that is connected here.
So 84, I actually was talking to a colleague about this, and he told me that 84 was a very meaningful number in numerology, particularly in relationship to art making. So I don't know if you're kind of talking about that, but for, that number, it was basically, my aunt gave me this mug, and she said, hey, this mug was fired 84 times. And so that 84 became this big question. Like, it seemed, it's like, they say things about, like, people are actually much worse at making really big decisions than we actually think. When questions get too complex, we kind of like index on one thing, whatever the first thing is. I saw 84 as that, like, how can this potter understand and choose, like, firing number 84 over firing number 57 or 34? Like, what was their recording process? And then, of course, it wasn't anything like that at all. It was about about the artist becoming the instrument, or becoming the site of change. So that's how I think that works. And then Anne Frank, the basic part of it was, I think I grew up in a time in the United States when every middle school person read The Diary of Anne Frank, and I just thought I knew what it was. And then somehow I saw a big one, like this big, and it was the revised critical edition, and it really just blew my mind. I think it was around the 2000s, where I was like, where maybe reality TV and stuff was really something I thought a lot about, and I thought, oh, this is so pioneering in terms of what how reality as something that you can experience is encapsulated. And part of that was I personally think, Otto Frank, in reading the history of this, Otto Frank really gave his daughter the diary before they went into hiding, but it wasn't before he had actually secured the hiding place. So he knew what was going to happen in a sense. And so I don't think he knew that the diary would be published, but he knew that the diary was something for Anne to help her through this. And so I thought about that, like how recording and experience relate to each other, that they're not necessarily how they relate to each other. And I was just moved. I think the other thing is you read the Diary of Anne Frank and the way it ends. I'm certainly a person who reads a lot more nonfiction than fiction. And so the end of a nonfiction book is never regularly heartbreaking, but the book just cracks, it just so I thought it's so crazy that in some ways gives it its documentary appeal, and sort of knowing that looking at the object is also extremely powerful, knowing what the object holds or what it embodies. As a reader.
I'd like to comment that I really loved your narrative intro. It sounded very fiction-like, and yet it took me on a ride. I had to trust you. And while you were doing that form, you were also giving me an equal visual sensory ride of who you are. And so there was just this new form of not just talking about yourself that you were doing, and I found that very fascinating. And
Thanks.
And the richness that you were talking about in recording. And I was wondering, what's an idea of yours in doing a new form of recording that you've either ignored or you have decided to pursue now?
It's just an idea, so likely it doesn't work, but it's just like a daydream. But I've been thinking about keeping maybe this is stupid. I've been thinking about keeping a virtual reality journal, along the lines of Gauguin's Noah diaries, where it would be the diary of a non-digital native, and I would go into a virtual reality space, and it's really fun because you can write in 3 dimensions. So I would have a 3-dimensional diary, and you can move anywhere in space. So I would have a text that would be spatial as well as temporal, and I would assume I'd read some things about how it kind of messes you up if you're in virtual reality too long, and then you get these hangover, they call it a reality hangover, where you take the thing off and this life is so low dimensional, and so that would be a way of going into myself by going into this space. So that's why planning to do this summer. Why would I do it in the summer? I don't know, yeah.
Connecting back to making meaning in the absence of words, but not necessarily in the absence of language, how would you describe your language to someone who hadn't seen your art before?
Wow. Can you elaborate what you mean? I mean, you don't have to, but what you mean by my language?
Your language is in, you talk about like, okay, so if we disconnect words from language, we still see signs and things. There's still the semiotics of, there's still the symbolism, there's still the things like that. So knowing that about language, when it doesn't include words, that's sort of my question. Like, what are your signs? What are your semiotics?
Whoa. Okay. Maybe I'm just gonna take like, I don't know. I mean, is that something? Okay, is that something someone can know about themselves? Like I don't know who this quote is by, but it was like, maybe it's by like, I don't know. But he said like, I'm a bird, not an ornithologist, or something. So, but yeah, like I respect your question. It's certainly something that happens that I ask myself. But I guess it's not necessarily something I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out. I think I've spent a lot more time trying to use my language than trying to define it. Maybe that's like about the future and sort of wanting conversations like these to be moments where a definition happens via contact with someone else. But I consider myself in the position of a user, not necessarily. Yeah, maybe that's the closest role I have. But yeah, maybe I should think about it more. I will. Thanks.
You mentioned you feel your work is more comfortable in its relationship to time rather than the space. What importance do you place on the physical art object?
Well, I would maybe a list. Like, I think. Well, firstly, like, like maybe one of the images you saw, there was like a T-shirt that had like these skins on it. It was made of eggplant skins, and I liked that material because it was unitary, but it was always different. Each skin was different. Each skin lived and preserved differently. But I think that object, it has a boundary in which if it decays too much, it is no longer an acceptable representation of the idea. So like physical objects don't always hold the ideas that they're associated with. In addition, I like looking at things. I like being in a room with a thing. I like the physical interaction of art. So the extent to which like art forms can be dematerialized or broadcast, for me, I tend to like things that happen via these encounters, and the encounters almost always include my body. So I don't really have any polemics about that, about where art has to happen, but I just find myself liking those kind of encounters, which might be a kind of the conservative side of art, but I like objects in a room. I like feeling my body against it, at least in terms of a cognition. Am I answering your question? Yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell us about any distinctions in your art between organizing chaos and propelling it?
Okay, distinction between organizing chaos and propelling it. Well, maybe you have one in mind, and maybe I can respond to that. No?
I'm just thinking more about, I guess, 84 and the length of chaos. For me, for some reason, it stuck out as like a good enough grade, like just barely passing. Like
out of 100.
An average. Yeah, you said almost complete, but like nothing Excelsior or whatever.
Okay. Well, actually, like that helps me. Like, so, like history of equivalentistics, those photos where I'm trying to find an equivalent or a pair. In some ways, like the lensing that was happening was like, you look at a set, is this a disorganized set or is it an organized set? Is there a hierarchy? Is there no hierarchy? Is there a value? Is there a point? Is there an organization? And how does that happen? So for me, the coincidence or the idea that two photos come together, they close the set and they kind of render that set, let's say like, like homeostasis. Like now the set has found its like resting point. But at any moment I can look at those photos. Yeah, we can go back. Like they're not that similar, right? Like, so, and I think there is something in relationship to the kind of perpetual task of science, where it's like, there are multiple ways in which I can continue to tighten the criteria of my equivalence, which by doing so opens up the whole process back into chaos, right? I guess my answer is that they happen simultaneously. The act of going into the set is like an acknowledgement of both at the same time. Yeah. Yeah.
Early on, you said that the Zen master, or to a Zen master, memory is completely impersonal.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that?
Well, that was something that my dad would tell his golf students, and then I quoted something from Rauschenberg, but I do like those statements. Maybe one thing I found about, if we go back to artifacts, I think one of the, since I came to art kind of like in a roundabout way, I think I always found artifacts much more inspiring than artworks. There's like this kind of unreliable freedom you get when you look at something and you don't know anything about it. And it just set my mind going. And I understand how problematic that is, but it's also powerful. And so in these ways, like one's identity like grounds you in the world and gives you a sense of who you are, and that's super rich. But then there like this idea of memory being impersonal, it's kind of like a vacation from that, I think. I don't know if one could live one's whole life in that vacation state, but I think that's the role it plays. Yeah, to be footloose.
We have time for one more question.
So this was sparked by you mentioning like the almost desperate pleas some people had for like an explanation of your art. If I think about art, like generally it's a process where an artist takes a material and they're like the sort of mediator between the material and its expression. It feels like in your case, there's a lot, it's almost like that process is inverted where the material mediates your expression. And I was curious if, as an artist, do you feel maybe more distanced or more alienated from your audience because of that role that the material plays? And do you see in that like maybe a cause for why people were so desperate for an explanation, looking for that mediation then through language, a more comfortable medium?
You guys are really thinking. Yeah, that's really cool. Okay. I like what you said. I think it resonates with me. I don't think it alienates me from my audience because maybe I'm wrong, but I just assume that's how everyone experiences life, as like something mediated through something that they don't control. So I kind of think it's like, oh, this is what it is. This is what being in a body is like, right? This is like how it goes, right? It's not these grand narratives of like an artist like chops form into like an object and then genius occurs. It's like, it's all of this like, all of the other stuff that perhaps we should value way more. There was something else. Okay, there was something else that I didn't respond to yet, no? There was like, there was like mediating form, the form mediates me.
Oh, maybe the appeal language had as some, maybe a more comfortable form for the audience because you're engaging in novel like materials and then also letting them exercise their own mediation rather than taking a more directing role.
Oh, okay, I have a good, I was reading this thing. It's funny because I can't really find the actual reference that she's responding to, but Hannah Arendt in Life of the Mind, she is like kind of going through maybe like Greek philosophy, and she talks about how the Greeks, for them, science or direct observation of the world was about preserving the phenomena of the world, which I thought was super beautiful and actually like a really important task for an artist or anyone. So like, maybe that's my answer to you. It's like, it's not just about pointing these things out. It's pointing them out in a way that they have meaning and they can be preserved. The idea that phenomena just exists and continues to exist and we as humans encounter it in its existence, I don't think that's right. I think we preserve phenomena, we give it life, we kill it. So that's the kind of stakes of being sandwiched. Thanks.
I think that's
Right at one.